What if everything you thought you knew about the beginning was wrong? What if the story of Adam and Eve wasn't the complete truth? Tonight, we're going to uncover one of history's most dangerous secrets. A story so threatening to established power that it was systematically erased from religious texts for over 2,000 years. You've heard of Adam and Eve, but have you ever wondered why there are actually two different creation stories in Genesis? Why does the first chapter say God created man and woman together, but the second chapter tells us Eve was made from Adam's rib? This isn't just an oversight, it's evidence of a cover-up that reaches back to ancient times. Before we dive into this forbidden knowledge, if you're enjoying this journey into hidden history, hit that like button. It really helps us reach more truth seekers like yourself. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, because we're just getting started on this incredible story. Picture this. A woman stands at the gates of paradise, her wild hair flowing in the wind. She's beautiful, powerful, and absolutely terrifying to those who believe women should be silent and submissive. Her name is Lilith, and she was Adam's first wife, not Eve, Lilith. And her story will change everything you think you know about creation, gender, and the price of freedom. But here's what's truly shocking. Lilith didn't leave paradise because she was evil. She left because she refused to be treated as less than equal to Adam. She wouldn't lie beneath him during intimacy, wouldn't accept his authority over her decisions, and wouldn't pretend that God had created her to be his servant when she knew she was his equal. Imagine the implications of this story becoming widely known in ancient patriarchal societies. A woman who stood up to the first man, a woman who chose exile over submission, a woman who spoke the sacred name of God with such power that angels trembled. No wonder they tried to erase her. Tonight, we're going to piece together her complete story from fragments hidden in ancient texts, archaeological discoveries that scholars whisper about in academic circles, and mystical traditions that have kept her memory alive despite centuries of suppression. We'll explore the Babylonian Talmud, medieval mystical texts, to bow to male authority. So how did an ancient goddess of independence become demonized as a child-stealing monster? How did the first woman's quest for equality become twisted into a cautionary tale about female rebellion? And why are more people today rediscovering her story than ever before? The answers lie in understanding how religious and political authorities throughout history have used the suppression of women's stories to maintain power. Lilith's story isn't just ancient mythology, it's a mirror reflecting our modern struggles with equality, autonomy, and the right to define ourselves rather than accepting others' definitions. Think about this controversial question. If Lilith was truly evil, why did protecting against her require such elaborate rituals? Why were ancient Jewish mothers so terrified of a figure who supposedly had no real power? Could it be that they feared not her evil, but her example of a woman who chose freedom over security? Here's what we're going to uncover together. Lilith's true origins in ancient Mesopotamian religion, her transformation from goddess to Adam's equal partner, the real reason she left Eden, her survival in Jewish mystical traditions, her demonization by patriarchal authorities, and her modern resurrection as a symbol of feminist empowerment. But we're also going to ask the hard questions that make people uncomfortable. Was Lilith right to leave Adam? Did her refusal to submit make her a hero or a villain? And what does her story teach us about the price women have always paid for demanding equality? I'll tell you something that might surprise you. Some of the most interesting Lilith research today is coming from female biblical scholars who are finding evidence that she represents an ancient tradition of women's spiritual authority that existed long before patriarchal religions suppressed it. By the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand why Lilith's story has never really died, why it keeps resurfacing in every generation, and why it's more relevant today than it's been in centuries. You'll also understand why some people don't want you to know her true story. So grab something comfortable to drink, Settle in for the long haul, because we're about to dive deep into ancient mysteries, forbidden texts, and revolutionary ideas that have been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. This is the story of Lilith, the first feminist, independence. In the great city of Babylon, where the hanging gardens reached toward heaven, and scholars mapped the movements of stars, priests told stories of Inanna, the goddess who descended to the underworld and returned transformed. They spoke of Ereshkigal, queen of the dead who bowed to no one, and they whispered of the Lilitu, night spirits who embodied the wild, untamable aspects of femininity. Picture ancient Sumerian temples where priestesses held equal authority with priests, where goddess worship wasn't unusual but central to religious life. These weren't primitive peoples stumbling in darkness. They created the first written laws, invented mathematics as we know it, and developed astronomical knowledge that wouldn't be matched for millennia. And in their creation stories, feminine power wasn't secondary to masculine authority. It was the source from which all life emerged. The goddess Tiamat was the primordial ocean from which gods and humans arose. Namu was the creator deity who shaped the first humans from clay. These weren't helpmates or companions. They were the primary creative forces of the universe. But here's where it gets fascinating and controversial. When the Jewish people were conquered and taken into Babylonian exile in 586 BCE, they didn't just passively preserve their own traditions. They encountered these powerful stories of feminine, divine authority and began incorporating elements into their own understanding of creation. Think about the implications. Jewish scholars sitting in Babylonian libraries reading about goddesses who refused to submit to male authority began to wonder, could there have been an earlier version of their own creation story? One where woman was created as equal to man rather than as his helper. This cultural mixing wasn't accidental. It was survival. When your temple is destroyed and your people scattered, you adapt or disappear. The Jewish exile lasted 70 years, long enough for entire generations to grow up speaking Babylonian languages and absorbing Mesopotamian ideas. Let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. What if the stories we consider purely Jewish actually contain borrowed elements from other cultures? Goddesses they'd encountered refused to accept subordinate status. But don't think this was just academic speculation. Archaeological evidence shows that belief in Lilith-type figures was widespread throughout the ancient Middle East. Clay tablets from Assyria describe rituals for protecting against Lilitu spirits. Amulets from ancient Israel invoke protection against night demons, with strikingly similar characteristics to later Jewish descriptions of Lilith. If you're watching this with friends or family, ask them this question. Why would ancient peoples across different cultures develop such similar stories about powerful feminine spirits? Could it be that these stories preserved memories of earlier times when women held different roles in society? The transformation of Lilith from Mesopotamian goddess spirit to Jewish first woman reveals something profound about how cultures preserve dangerous knowledge. Official histories might suppress certain truths, but folklore finds ways to keep them alive through stories, songs, and symbols. Consider this controversial possibility. Maybe Lilith wasn't added to Jewish tradition as a foreign corruption. Maybe her story represents an older layer of Hebrew religion that recognized feminine spiritual authority before patriarchal influences suppressed it. Recent discoveries of ancient Hebrew inscriptions mentioning Asherah, consort of Yahweh, suggest that early Jewish religion was less strictly monotheistic than later traditions claimed. Archaeological evidence from places like Khirbet el-Kom shows that ordinary Jewish families prayed to both masculine and feminine divine figures. This context makes Lilith's eventual emergence in Jewish texts less surprising and more inevitable. She represents the return of the repressed, the acknowledgement that creation itself might contain both cooperative and conflicting forces, both masculine and feminine principles. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite centuries of official suppression, despite being labeled as demonic, despite being written out of mainstream religious teaching, Lilith's story survived. It survived in mystical texts, in folklore, in protective amulets, in whispered warnings passed from mother to daughter. And it survived because it answered questions that official stories left unanswered. Questions like, why do women sometimes feel trapped by traditional roles? Why does equality seem threatening to established authorities? Why does sanitized version you might expect, but a dramatic story of two equals discovering that equality is more complicated and challenging than either had imagined. We'll see how paradise itself couldn't contain the explosive tension between Adam's desire for order and Lilith's demand for respect. But first, think about this. If someone today told you that your entire understanding of a familiar story was incomplete, that crucial details had been deliberately hidden, how would you react? Would you be curious or defensive? Would you want to learn more or protect what you already believe? That's exactly the choice our ancestors faced when they encountered Lilith's story. And it's the same choice you face right now. The morning God decided to create woman for the second time, the air in Eden hummed with creative energy. But this wasn't the beginning of the story. This was already chapter 2 of a drama that had started, failed, and was now being rewritten. Close your eyes and imagine Eden before Eve, before the famous apple, before innocence was lost. Picture Adam walking alone among creatures that moved in pairs, calling out names that echoed in emptiness, searching for someone like himself in a garden full of animals that couldn't match his need for intellectual and emotional companionship. But this loneliness wasn't Adam's first experience. He had known companionship before. He had shared paradise with someone who walked upright as he did, who spoke with wisdom that challenged and delighted him, who carried the same divine spark in eyes that sometimes flashed with unsettling independence. Her name had been Lilith. The ancient texts tell us that God formed her from the same earth that had given birth to Adam, not from his rib, not as an afterthought, not as a helper created to meet his needs. She emerged from clay and divine breath as his absolute equal, shaped by the same hands, animated by the same spirit, intended as his partner in every sense of the word. Imagine that moment of first meeting. Adam, who had been naming animals and organizing paradise, suddenly, face to face, with someone who looked back at him with equal intelligence, equal authority, equal claim to the world they shared. The recognition must have been electric. Finally, another lengthening as day progressed toward evening. Adam found deep satisfaction in understanding how things worked, in creating order and naming patterns. He would spend hours categorizing plants by their properties, organizing areas of the garden according to logical principles. Lilith moved through Eden differently. Where Adam sought to understand and organize, she seemed content to simply experience and wonder. She would lie for hours watching clouds form impossible shapes, or sit motionless while butterflies landed on her shoulders, or disappear for days exploring regions of paradise that Adam hadn't yet mapped. These differences created the first tension in paradise. Not evil, not rebellion, just the natural friction that occurs when two strong personalities with different worldviews share the same space. Adam began to feel that Lilith's wandering disrupted the order he was trying to create. Lilith began to sense that Adam's need for control was limiting her freedom to explore. The conflict that would ultimately shatter their relationship began, ironically, in their most intimate moments. When they came together physically, Adam naturally assumed the dominant position. To him, this felt right and proper. He was stronger, larger, and had been in Eden longer. The positioning reflected what seemed like natural hierarchy. But Lilith questioned this assumption with words that would echo through history. Why should I lie beneath you when we were created from the same earth? Why should position in our lovemaking suggest that one of us has authority over the other? Think about how revolutionary this question was in the ancient world. Here was a woman demanding not just respect, but equality in the most intimate sphere of relationship. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was asking for the same rights and dignity that Adam took for granted. Adam's response revealed assumptions he hadn't even realized he held. He pointed to the natural world around them. Male lions dominated prides. Roosters ruled hen houses. Rams led flocks. Surely this proved that masculine authority was woven into creation itself. But Lilith had observed different patterns. She had watched eagles soar as equals. Harmony could only exist between equals. That forced submission bred resentment rather than love. The breaking point came during an argument that began about something small, whether to plant new fruit trees in the eastern or western section of their garden. But it escalated into something much larger when Adam declared that as head of their household, his decision should be final. That's when Lilith spoke the name of God with such power that the ground shook and angels paused in their eternal songs. She called upon their Creator to witness that she had been made equal, that submission was not part of her essential nature, that forcing her into subordinate roles violated the very intention of her creation. The sacred name, once spoken in desperate appeal for justice, unleashed forces that neither Adam nor Lilith had anticipated. Ancient Jewish tradition teaches that certain divine words carry creative power. Speaking them in moments of intense emotion can reshape reality in unexpected ways. Lilith felt change beginning within her, a loosening of ties that had bound her to Eden and to Adam. The speaking of the ineffable name had awakened something wild and independent in her nature, something that could no longer coexist with Adam's vision of ordered hierarchy. Standing at the threshold of Paradise's eastern gate, Lilith faced the choice that would define her throughout history. She could surrender her authenticity for the sake of peace, accept Adam's authority and remain in paradise. Or she could honor her true nature and step into an uncertain wilderness where freedom came without guarantees. For Lilith, this wasn't really a choice at all. As dawn broke over Eden, she walked away from paradise, each step taking her further from security and closer to whatever destiny awaited her in the unknown world beyond. Coming up, we'll follow Lilith into the wilderness and discover what happened to the first woman who chose freedom over submission. But we'll also explore the devastating impact her departure had on Adam and why God decided to try creating woman differently the second time. Adam woke to silence that felt wrong in a garden where morning usually brought symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves. The space beside him where Lilith should have been sleeping remained empty, still indented with the shape of her body but cold to his touch. At first, he assumed she had risen early. Lilith's physical departure, but the removal of her unique energy that had animated their shared paradise. By midday, Adam's confusion had transformed into something he'd never experienced before. Genuine fear. Not fear of physical danger, for nothing in Eden could harm him, but fear of emotional devastation. For the first time since his creation, Adam understood what loss meant. He searched every grove and meadow where they had walked together, every stream where they had bathed, every clearing where they had made love under stars that sang their names. But Eden, vast as it was yielded no trace of the woman who had shared his existence, and then vanished like morning mist. That evening, Adam knelt beside their favorite stream and poured out his heart to the Creator, in words that came from depths of pain he hadn't known he possessed. Why had Lilith abandoned their perfect home? Why had their disagreements driven her to such desperate action? Why did her demand for equality matter more to her than their love? If you're watching this with someone special, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a relationship where you loved someone deeply, but couldn't agree on fundamental issues of respect and equality? How did you handle that tension? Share your thoughts in the comments. This story is ultimately about struggles we all face. God's response came not in thunderous pronouncement, but in gentle understanding that settled into Adam's consciousness like dew on morning grass. Lilith had been created equal, formed with the same divine spark that animated his own soul. Her departure wasn't rebellion against divine will, but assertion of the independence that God had built into her very nature. This revelation brought Adam little comfort. If Lilith was meant to be free, why did her freedom leave him so devastated? If equality was part of divine design, why couldn't they have found ways to honor both her autonomy and their partnership? The questions multiplied without satisfying answers. Days stretched into weeks as Adam struggled with emotions that had no names in paradise. Grief, regret, loneliness, and something else. A growing understanding that his expectations, leadership and authority. He remembered moments when Lilith's different perspective had enriched his understanding of creation. Her questions had forced him to think more deeply about divine intentions. Her alternative interpretations of natural patterns had revealed complexities he might never have noticed alone. The very qualities that had frustrated him now seemed precious in their absence. For weeks, Adam wandered Eden in a state of emotional education. He was learning that relationship required more than love. It demanded respect, compromise, and willingness to grow. He was discovering that authority meant nothing without consent, that leadership was meaningless if it forced others to deny their authentic selves. During this period of solitary reflection, Adam also began to understand something crucial about himself. Much of his identity had been built around being Lilith's partner, provider, and protector. Without her to lead and shelter, he felt adrift, uncertain of his purpose in divine plan. This is where God's wisdom becomes apparent. The Creator allowed Adam to fully experience loss before attempting to provide another companion. This wasn't cruelty, but necessary education. Adam needed to understand what partnership truly required before he could successfully share his life with another equal being. When God finally announced the intention to create another woman, Adam felt both hope and apprehension. Would this new companion also question his authority? Would she possess the same fierce independence that had made harmony with Lilith so difficult to achieve? His longing for companionship battled with fear of repeating past failures. The method of creation differed dramatically this time. Instead of forming woman from separate earth, as had been done with Lilith, God caused deep sleep to fall upon Adam. From his own rib, from his own flesh and bone, the Creator fashioned his second companion. The symbolism was intentional and profound. This woman would be part of him in ways Lilith never had been, connected to him through shared physical substance rather than merely shared divine breath. She would understand him from the inside because she literally came from inside him. Adam awakened to find Eve standing beside him, beautiful and gentle, and somehow familiar in ways that Lilith, for descriptions of proper relationships between creatures. But even as Adam celebrated this new harmony, something in his memory preserved appreciation for what Lilith had brought to his existence. Her challenges had forced him to examine his beliefs more deeply. Her questions had revealed dimensions of creation he might never have explored. Her presence had awakened parts of himself that remained dormant in the peaceful routine he shared with Eve. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Adam wondered about Lilith's fate in the wilderness beyond Eden's gates. Had she found the freedom she sought? Did she regret the paradise she had abandoned? Did she ever think of the love they had shared, despite their fundamental differences? These thoughts came less frequently as time passed and his relationship with Eve deepened. The new harmony gradually healed wounds Lilith's departure had created. But seeds of future trouble had been planted in the very solution God had chosen. Eve's willingness to accept Adam's authority while bringing peace also made her vulnerable in ways Lilith never had been. Her trusting nature, combined with inexperience in questioning motives, would eventually create opportunities for deception that Lilith's skeptical mind might have recognized and resisted. The serpent, when it finally appeared in Eden, would recognize this vulnerability immediately and exploit it with devastating effectiveness. The very submission that brought harmony with Adam would lead to catastrophe for them both. But that's a story for another time. Right now, I want you to think about something. Which relationship model do you find more appealing? Adam and Lilith's passionate but conflict-filled equality, or Adam and Eve's peaceful but hierarchical partnership? And what does your preference reveal about your own beliefs about love, respect, and power? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden biblical history. Coming up next, we'll follow Lilith into the wilderness and discover how the first independent woman survived in a hostile world, and how her story began to change from tragedy to legend. Beyond Eden's eastern gate, where paradise met the untamed world, Lilith took her first breath of air that carried no divine power. Been beautiful. Yes, Adam had loved her in his own way, but accepting his authority would have been slow death of everything that made her herself. The first nights were the hardest. Eden had never known true darkness. Even at midnight, a gentle radiance had illuminated the garden paths. But wilderness darkness was complete, filled with sounds that spoke of creatures she didn't recognize, dangers she couldn't anticipate. Lilith learned to read the sky for weather signs, to identify which plants might nourish and which would poison, to find shelter in caves that offered protection from wind and rain. Survival demanded wisdom that paradise had never required, skills that grew from necessity rather than curiosity. But the physical challenges paled compared to the emotional isolation. In Eden, she had known constant companionship, Adam's presence, the animals' friendship, the occasional visits from angels who brought messages from the divine realm. The wilderness offered solitude so complete it seemed to echo with its own emptiness. During her darkest moments, usually in the hour before dawn when hope runs thinnest, Lilith questioned whether pride had led her to make a terrible mistake. Would submission to Adam's expectations have been preferable to this endless loneliness? Was equality worth the price of abandoning all love and companionship? Here's something to think about as you're watching. Have you ever made a choice that you knew was right, but that cost you more than you expected? How did you find the strength to keep going when doubt crept in? Let us know in the comments. These are the moments that define us. But each time doubt crept into her thoughts, memory of Eden's constraints renewed her determination. She remembered the daily arguments, the constant pressure to deny her authentic nature, the slow suffocation of pretending to be less than she was. Freedom might be lonely, but slavery would have been death of spirit. What happened next depends on which ancient texts you believe. Some sources suggest that Lilith's solitude attracted the attention of beings that had existed in the wilderness since before human creation. Not demons in the way later traditions would understand evil, but ancient powers that ruled the spaces between civilization and chaos. These entities, fascinated by a creature's harmony. Other traditions suggest that Lilith's transformation was less dramatic, but no less significant. Cut off from regular communion with her creator, she simply adapted to survive in a world that offered no protection for the weak or unprepared. She became what the wilderness required her to become: fierce, self-reliant, uncompromising in her refusal to accept subordinate status to any being. Archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia supports the idea that Lilith-like figures were known throughout the region long before Jewish texts mentioned her. Clay tablets describe rituals for appeasing night spirits who dwelt in ruined places, beings who embodied the wild aspects of femininity that civilization couldn't domesticate. These weren't necessarily evil entities, but dangerous ones, unpredictable, powerful, operating according to their own codes rather than society's expectations. They represented the shadow side of creation, the forces that challenged order, precisely because challenge was necessary for growth and change. As years passed in the wilderness, Lilith developed abilities that Eden had never acquired. She learned to move silently through landscapes that would defeat experienced hunters. She mastered the art of finding water in seemingly barren places. She developed intuitive understanding of which creatures could be trusted and which posed threats. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to be completely self-sufficient. No one else would provide for her needs, protect her from danger, or make her decisions. Complete independence required complete responsibility for her choices, her survival, her happiness or misery. This radical self-reliance would later be interpreted by patriarchal societies as evidence of her dangerous nature. A woman who needed no protection, who made her own decisions, who refused to acknowledge masculine authority. Such a creature threatened the very foundations of civilization as they understood it. The transformation wasn't entirely negative. Freed from Eden's constraints, Lilith discovered capabilities she might never have developed in Paradise's sheltered environment. She became a master of survival skills, a reader of natural signs, a being who understood the raw forces of creation in ways that domesticated life never reveals. The world she had left behind. Stories began to circulate among desert peoples about a woman who walked with wolves, who could cool storms or calm them, who possessed knowledge that came not from submission, but from fearless exploration of life's darker mysteries. Coming up next, we'll explore how these wilderness stories eventually reached settled communities, and how Lilith's growing legend began to terrify people who had never even met her. We'll also discover the real reason why her story became a weapon used against women who dared to demand equality. If this exploration of hidden history is opening your eyes to new possibilities, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear Lilith's true story. The truth has been buried long enough. News travels fast in the ancient world, especially news about a woman who breaks every rule society has established, the feminine behavior. Merchant caravans crossing desert routes brought stories of a wild woman who lived alone in places where even armed men feared to travel. Shepherds whispered about encounters with someone who could speak the language of wolves and ravens, who appeared at water sources during droughts, then vanished like morning mist. These stories grew in the telling, as stories always do. What began as accounts of an unusual hermit woman evolved into tales of supernatural encounters that left witnesses both terrified and strangely exhilarated. Lilith was becoming something larger than herself, a symbol that carried meanings beyond her individual story. But here's where it gets really interesting and controversial. The same religious authorities who had supported the suppression of women's equality in their own communities began using Lilith's story as a weapon to reinforce their control. They transformed her from exile seeking freedom into monster threatening civilization. Think about the psychology behind this transformation. If Lilith could be portrayed as evil, dangerous, and destructive, then her original demand for equality could be dismissed as evidence of her corrupt nature. Women who exhibited similar independence could be warned that they were following Lilith's path toward damnation. The process of demonization wasn't sudden or uniform. It happened gradually, through countless small changes in how her story was told. Her refusal to submit became rebellion against God. Her independence embedded herself in popular consciousness, and how seriously even educated people took the threat she supposedly represented. These weren't primitive superstitions, but careful religious practices, developed by scholars who studied divine law with the same rigor they applied to commercial contracts. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled over centuries of rabbinical discussion, contains multiple references to Lilith that treat her as established fact rather than speculative fiction. Tractate Shabbat describes her as a creature with long hair who preys upon men who sleep alone. Tractate Eruvin mentions her presence in ruined houses, suggesting she inhabits spaces where normal order has broken down. Let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. What if these protective rituals weren't really about supernatural threats, but about controlling women's behavior? What if the fear of becoming like Lilith was used to keep women from demanding the equality she had sought? The transformation process reveals something profound about how patriarchal societies manage threats to their authority. Rather than examining the conditions that drove Lilith to leave paradise, the stories focus on her supposed vindictiveness after departure. Rather than questioning Adam's expectations, they demonize her refusal to meet them. But the demonization was never complete or consistent. Even the harshest rabbinical commentaries acknowledged Lilith's intelligence and power. She wasn't portrayed as simple evil, but as complex force that required serious precautions. Her very danger proved her significance in divine plan. Archaeological discoveries have revealed how widespread belief in Lilith became throughout the ancient Middle East. Babylonian incantation bowls, designed to protect households from demonic influence, frequently mention her by name. These artifacts suggest her reputation as dangerous spirit extended far beyond Jewish communities into broader Mesopotamian culture. The geographical spread of her stories indicates how powerfully her archetype resonated across different societies. Each culture that encountered her tale adapted it to reflect their own anxieties about gender relationships and social order. The demon Lilith became vehicle for expressing universal fears about female independence. Christian traditions, developing parallel to Jewish interpretations, incorporated Lilith, sought to eliminate competing spiritual authorities. But here's something that should make us all think. Despite centuries of systematic demonization, despite being labeled as child-threatening monster, despite official condemnation by religious authorities, Lilith's story never completely disappeared. It kept surfacing in folklore, in mystical texts, in the whispered conversations of women who recognized something familiar in her rebellion. Folk traditions preserved ambivalent attitudes toward her character. While official religious teaching condemned her rebellion, popular stories sometimes admired her courage. Women facing their own domestic difficulties might privately identify with her refusal to submit to unreasonable demands. The persistence of her story reveals something crucial about how cultures preserve dangerous knowledge. Official condemnation can coexist with fascinated preservation, ensuring that challenging ideas survive, even when they threaten established order. Lilith's presence in demonological texts demonstrates this principle perfectly. Even as demon, she retained qualities that made her more than simple villain. Medieval texts describe her intelligence, her knowledge of secret names and hidden powers, her ability to move between worlds that ordinary beings couldn't access. The very qualities that made her dangerous also made her indispensable to the cosmic order. Some mystical traditions developed interpretations that went beyond simple good versus evil categories. These texts suggested Lilith's role as challenger and questioner, while disruptive to domestic harmony might be necessary for spiritual development. Comfort and unchallenged authority could lead to spiritual stagnation. The medieval period saw emergence of more romantic interpretations alongside the demonic ones. Poets began exploring the tragedy of her situation. A woman whose only crime was refusing to pretend inequality where God had created equals. These versions portrayed her not as monster, but as victim of circumstances beyond her control. Coming up, we'll dive into how medieval Jewish scholars tried to solve the Lilith problem, and how their debates revealed deep tensions within religious communities about women's roles, cultural borrowing, and the very nature of divine authority. Plus, we'll explore why some of the most brilliant minds in Jewish history couldn't agree on what Lilith's story actually meant and the role of women in God's plan. Lilith's story created a unique problem for these scholars. They couldn't ignore her because she appeared in too many ancient sources to dismiss as pure fiction. But they couldn't fully embrace her either, because her demand for equality challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and religious authority. Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, known as Rashi, one of the most influential biblical commentators in Jewish history, occasionally referenced Lilith in his interpretations. But his mentions are careful, almost cautious, as if he recognized the explosive potential of her story. He treats her as a historical figure, while avoiding detailed discussion of her motivations or the justice of her cause. The tension becomes clear when you read medieval responsa literature, rabbinical answers to practical legal questions submitted by communities across Europe and North Africa. Several surviving documents address questions about protection against Lilith, treating her threat as seriously as they would discuss commercial law or marriage contracts. Here's what's remarkable about these scholarly discussions. They reveal how thoroughly Lilith had been integrated into Jewish intellectual consciousness, even among people who were uncomfortable with her implications. These were brilliant minds who had memorized vast portions of Talmud and could debate fine points of religious law for hours. And they took her existence as given fact. But the scholars faced a fundamental dilemma. If they acknowledged Lilith's equality with Adam, they opened questions about whether women in general deserved equal treatment. If they condemned her rebellion, they risked appearing to endorse Adam's potentially unreasonable demands. Either position carried dangerous implications for their patriarchal society. The solution many developed was to focus on the method of her departure, rather than the justice of her cause. They could condemn her use of the ineffable name as inappropriate, while avoiding judgment about whether her grievances were legitimate. This allowed them to preserve her story, while limiting its subversive potential. The alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, represents the most detailed scholarly attempt to resolve the Lilith problem. This text acknowledges her creation as Adam's equal, while explaining why she had to be replaced with the more submissive Eve. Mentions indicate how thoroughly she had been woven into mainstream religious consciousness. The scholarly debates weren't just about Lilith herself, but about larger questions of cultural borrowing and religious purity. Some rabbis worried that embracing stories with Mesopotamian origins compromised Jewish theological integrity. Others argued that truth could be found in multiple traditions if properly interpreted. These discussions revealed deep tensions within medieval Jewish communities about women's roles and religious authority. Progressive voices acknowledged that Lilith's demand for equality deserved serious consideration. Conservative authorities insisted that her rebellion, regardless of motivation, set dangerous precedent for social order. But here's something fascinating. Even the most conservative scholars couldn't bring themselves to condemn Lilith completely. They recognized something admirable in her refusal to compromise her principles, even when compromise would have been easier and safer. The great medieval philosopher Maimonides, whose rational approach to religion influenced Jewish thought for centuries, mentions Lilith only briefly in his writings. But his references treat her as accepted fact rather than debatable legend, suggesting that even the most intellectually rigorous scholars couldn't dismiss her entirely. Rabbinical discussions about protective amulets reveal another dimension of the scholarly dilemma. These educated men had to provide practical guidance to communities that believed Lilith posed real supernatural threat, even when they might have privately questioned the literal truth of demonic accounts. The result was a complex dance between public teaching and private skepticism. Scholars provided the protective rituals their communities demanded, while developing theological interpretations that preserved Lilith's dignity, even as they acknowledged the fear she inspired. Some mystical scholars took entirely different approaches, suggesting that Lilith's story contained hidden truths about divine nature that could only be understood through careful spiritual interpretation. These Kabbalistic readings transformed her from dangerous demon into necessary cosmic principle. The geographic spread of scholarly Lilith discussions demonstrates how thoroughly her story had penetrated Jewish intellectual culture, about how intellectual traditions handle dangerous ideas. Rather than complete suppression, they often choose careful preservation, combined with interpretive frameworks that limit subversive potential. This approach allowed Lilith's story to survive through centuries when it might otherwise have been lost, ensuring that later generations would have access to her example of a woman who chose authenticity over security, freedom over comfort, principle over peace. Coming up next, we'll explore how mystical Jewish traditions transformed Lilith from individual figure into cosmic principle, and how these esoteric interpretations influenced everything from medieval magic to modern feminist theory. The story gets even more fascinating from here. But first, let me ask you, do you think the medieval scholars were right to preserve Lilith's story, even while trying to limit its impact? Or should they have either fully embraced or completely rejected her? Share your thoughts in the comments. In the hidden chambers of medieval Spanish synagogues, where candlelight flickered across ancient manuscripts written in careful Hebrew script, Kabbalistic masters contemplated mysteries that went far beyond surface religious teaching. These mystics saw Lilith not as individual demon or historical figure, but as fundamental force in the cosmic architecture of reality itself. The Zohar, Judaism's most important mystical text, presents Lilith in ways that transcend simple good versus evil categories. Written in 13th century Spain, but attributed to earlier authorities, this work describes her as representing the Sitra Achra, literally the other side, the shadow aspect of divine creation that gives meaning to light. Think about this revolutionary concept. What if Lilith's rebellion wasn't failure of divine plan, but essential part of it? What if her refusal to submit served cosmic purposes that mere human understanding couldn't grasp? The mystics suggested that without her challenges, divine creation would lack the tension necessary for spiritual growth and development. In Zoharic cosmology, Lilith becomes the dark mirror of the Shekinah, God's feminine presence in the world. Where Shekinah represents divine love and nurturing, Lilith embodies divine judgment and testing. Both are necessary aspects of complete divine nature. You can't have meaningful light, necessary resistance, the friction that makes spiritual growth possible. But here's where it gets really interesting for modern audiences. These mystical interpretations anticipated many concepts that wouldn't be widely discussed until the rise of modern psychology and systems thinking. The idea that healthy development requires challenge, that growth comes through overcoming resistance, that authentic relationships need space for disagreement and conflict. If you're finding these mystical insights fascinating, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more explorations of hidden wisdom in ancient texts. These ideas are more relevant to modern life than you might expect. The Kabbalistic text, Sefer HaZohar, describes Lilith's union with Samael, the angel of death, not as alliance between evil forces, but as cosmic marriage between necessary opposing principles. Their relationship generates the creative tension that drives all change and development in the universe. This mystical marriage produces what Kabbalists call the mixed multitude, beings that exist in the liminal spaces between pure categories. These entities serve as bridges between different levels of reality, translators between opposing forces that must somehow work together. In practical terms, this means Lilith's descendants aren't simply demons threatening human happiness, but necessary agents of transformation who appear when individuals or societies have become too comfortable, too rigid, too resistant to necessary change and growth. Medieval mystics who worked with these concepts often lived on the margins of their communities, suspected of trafficking with dangerous forces, while secretly serving essential spiritual functions. Like Lilith herself, they chose authenticity over acceptance, truth over comfort, growth over security. The great Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia wrote extensively about the spiritual necessity of encountering what he called the resistant feminine, forces that refuse to be controlled or domesticated, but must be engaged with respect and wisdom, rather than conquered or suppressed. These mystical traditions preserved something crucial that mainstream religious teaching often missed: the recognition that divine creation includes space for legitimate questioning, authentic disagreement, and principled resistance to unjust authority. Lilith becomes the patron saint of holy rebellion, but the mystics also understood something that possesses essential wisdom unavailable through other sources. Modern scholars studying these texts note their sophisticated understanding of what we would now call psychological integration, the necessity of acknowledging and working with all aspects of human nature, rather than trying to suppress qualities that seem threatening or uncomfortable. The mystical Lilith serves as guide for navigating what medieval Kabbalists called the dark night of the soul, those periods of spiritual development when old certainties crumble and new understanding hasn't yet crystallized. She teaches how to maintain authenticity and integrity during times of transition and uncertainty. Perhaps most remarkably, these mystical interpretations preserved Lilith's dignity and agency, even while acknowledging her dangerous aspects. She wasn't victim or villain, but conscious participant in cosmic drama, making difficult choices for reasons that transcended personal happiness or social approval. These Kabbalistic insights influenced later developments in Jewish mysticism, Christian esotericism, and eventually modern depth psychology. The idea that healthy development requires engagement with shadow aspects of personality traces directly back to medieval mystical understanding of Lilith's cosmic function. The mystics understood something profound. Lilith's story isn't really about ancient mythology, but about eternal human struggles with authority, authenticity, and the price of being true to yourself in a world that often demands conformity. Their preservation and development of her story ensured that future generations would have access to this crucial wisdom about the spiritual necessity of principled resistance and authentic self-expression. Coming up in our conclusion, how Lilith's ancient story speaks to modern struggles and why her example is more relevant today than it's been in centuries. But first, what do you think about these mystical interpretations? Do they change how you understand her story?